Hey everyone, it's Adam Tracy, and if you read the fintech TradFI news, there's been a great deal of discussion about the securitization or the tokenization of securities. And I don't mean some guy like tokenizing some real world asset with no exchange for those security tokens to like trade on, but rather tokenizing equities like Tesla, Amazon, you name it. And before, I kind of want to break this up into like a series, but before you can really frame the issue, it's important to understand how today traditional securities trades work, right? And so there's three components: execution, clearing, and settlement. Okay, so first, execution is simply going through your broker, executing a trade through like a matching engine, right? Through NASDAQ, New York Stock Exchange, ATS, whatever the case may be. Execution, very basic. From there, the trade details go to a central clearinghouse, which in the United States is the DTCC or its subsidiary, the National Securities Clearing Corporation. And the central counterparty model, which is what this is, basically is this like insurance thing, because it stands in the shoes of both the buyer and the seller in this transaction through something called novation. And the DTCC basically acts as like the unified sort of clearinghouse in the sense that it nets out the trade, right? It has shares here, shares there, and nets out the transfer of securities and cash on the other end, right? Then you move to settlement, which in the United States, we work on something called T+1. So the trade day plus one business day. So settlement is not the day it happens, the day after, right? And at that point, the trade is finalized, the transfer of funds or the transfer of the securities is effectuated via DTCC on their books, right? Just an intrabook transfer, and then Fedwire or something else stands to transfer the cash. Now you see it differently when you go broker to broker because they'll sort of advance those fees and make them available, right? Which we'll get to. So, and this has been the model for some time, right? For really since the advent of like, sort of high frequency type trading. And it's very archaic based on the technology we have, which is why we're having this discussion about, essentially how blockchain could make it better. So the main criticisms, right, that you'll find in the clearing, primarily in the clearing and settlement elements of securities transactions globally, especially in the United States, is one, the delay. It's not real time, right? It's not real time. It's T+1. Yes, you have delivery versus payment, and you have this sort of availability of funds in some cases, depending on your broker, but that leads to the second criticism, which is liquidity of these brokers, right? And you saw this during the GameStop sort of debacle, if you want to call it that. In order to allow for faster, access to funds and basically account for moments and days where there's extreme volatility, the DTCC will require margin and put margin requirements on your broker dealer, like a Robinhood, for instance, right? And so that is actually the impetus for like Xing out a lot of the retail players, right? Because they can't afford, the broker dealer can't afford to really like focus on these smaller trades when they have to meet these larger margin requirements. So they put institutional trades first, or larger block trades first, right? And that speaks to the third criticism, which is this central counterparty like theory, right? With DTCC standing in the midst of every single securities transaction that occurs. Well, what if it fails? What if there's some black swan event? What happens, right? And yes, you look at it and you say, okay, fine, it has the infrastructure and all this kind of stuff, but it's not blockchain, right? It's not immutable. It's subject to human error. It's subject to external nefarious forces more so than blockchain could ever be, right? So that's a huge thing. And then finally, another criticism which doesn't really impact, on a grand scale, the operation of it, but it's transparency. Very few people understand how them placing an order to buy 100 shares of Tesla goes from a broker dealer to NASDAQ to a clearing firm to DTCC and back, right? Like that whole round trip. And then conceivably you have other counterparties like transfer agents and stuff like that, which I'll get to at a later date, which could come into play. So there's like very little transparency, right? So the solution that everybody thinks is like super easy is like, okay, we'll just put it on the blockchain, right? Because in theory, it solves a lot of these problems, right? You could do almost real-time settlements. You could have full transparency. The risk, the counterparty risk would have like effectively go away because you're taking out a large part of the human element, and the margin requirements that are imposed on brokers, which, you know, sort of X out retail traders, largely disappear because you have faster settlements, right? And you have easier access to collateral. And like if you think about integrations like the concept of liquidity pools in, you know, like crypto, non-security type token crypto, well, that becomes kind of an element that you could reimagine and apply to, you know, securities trade. So I wanted to set this video out as sort of like a primer, because if you don't understand, right, how securities trades happen now, right, archaic as they may be, then simply saying, oh, well, let's put everything on the blockchain, you don't know why you're doing it, right? Like it's just, it doesn't make sense because you're not really comprehending how to address the problems that are inherent in this multi-party, you know, roundabout that is unduly expensive because you have all these parties and so on and so forth. So that is, let's call this part one of, let's call this TradFI 101. And in the next videos, I'll follow up with the specific integrations and applications of blockchain and tokenization and how that could alleviate some of these issues that I've discussed here. And then also we'll take a deeper dive into more of the nuanced elements of securities and also commodities trading for that matter, and see how what these products and these solutions that are being battered about could or could not, as it were, actually help the securities markets become more efficient and more fair to retail investors. So I'm Adam Tracy. If you have any questions, hit me up, adam@adamtracy.io. Talk to you next time. Cheers.